you doing, folks? Your host Moose here on the Pitt Panthers Football Network as we welcome you to another episode of the Season 7 offseason. We're getting closer and closer to the regular season as we go through and take a look at the roster right now in the change positions phase of the offseason. We didn't end up having a ton of guys that we needed to move around. We did have one player, and keep in mind these are before we changed some of the names, so if you see recruit names that don't match the ones that we said we have, this was before we ended up renaming the recruits, so that's why some of the names are their older names potentially before they were renamed. But basically we didn't have a ton of players that needed their positions changed. The biggest thing that we did was we did have some shifting on the offensive line. We also ended up having some defensive players to move around. We did have one athlete that we signed, so we needed a position selected for him as well. But otherwise, we didn't really have a ton of players to move around on the field. We also had a bunch of defensive ends that all came in with the same position, but left end, right end doesn't really matter in terms of overall anyways. So we ended up just basically evening things out there, so we had similar numbers of right ends and left ends. But otherwise, pretty much the same as we came in, and of course you see some players on here that won't be with us going into next season, but it's a very solid team. You know, a couple of notable points where we may have some low overalls, but we've done as much as we can to compensate for that, and we'll see later on in the episode. Very, very excited about the roster, though. I think we did a great job. You can see, of course, all the recruits there show up with their star ratings and everything, and we did a good job. We didn't have too many busts in the recruiting process. We had a couple linemen that ended up not being as good as we thought they might be. A couple of linebackers that were okay, defensive ends that weren't stellar, but they did enough to fit into the roster. Now, as far as roster moves, you can see we shook things up in terms of the tackles. We ended up moving J.D. Harris from right tackle inside to right guard to prep him for a starting role next year. We left David Horn outside at right tackle behind Daniel Jenkins. Daniel Jenkins will be a senior, which means Horn likely will start next year as well. So a couple of moves in that regard. We also moved, of course, our ends around. Weatherford and Bertain end up being right ends here behind Darren Johnson, who of course became Kenny O'Neill. Lanier and Jalen Hills hold down the left end position. So a little bit of a shakeout there. Linebackers, you can see, not really moved around. I think Marlon Capps was originally a right outside linebacker, so we moved him to left outside linebacker. Otherwise, those linebacker positions stay pretty much the same. And then safety-wise, of course, we shifted Keon Gibbs from strong safety to free safety. We also took Roger Mobley, who becomes Cameron Taylor-Smith, over to free safety as well. He was an athlete. And then, of course, we have Howard as well, true freshman, who becomes Earl Lemieux. And then finally, I didn't do it here on these position changes screen, but I did do it later on, is Cedric Granger. We decided to move him from cornerback over to free safety. Reason being, we don't have, a star free safety right now. Keon Gibbs, Taylor Smith, those kind of guys, they were going to be vying for playing time, but they have very little experience playing at all. Gibbs is more of a special teams guy. Taylor Smith's a true freshman. Cedric Granger is a guy that he doesn't have breakneck speed, but he does have good abilities. He has good coverage ability, good zone coverage, good man coverage. His tackling is solid. Really, the only weakness that he has is speed. So do we want to isolate him and put him in a weak area where that lack of speed may come back to bite him? No, absolutely not. So we move him out of the dime corner role that he's been playing, where he's stuck against slot receivers that are always quicker than him, and we put him into a safety role where hopefully then he can be playing against tight ends, he can play against halfbacks who come out of the backfield, or because he's going to be playing as our free safety, he has very good zone coverage. He sits back in that deep zone and tries to ball hawk a little bit for us. So I think that's going to suit his play style a little bit better, and I like that for him moving forward. Now, as we go through the offseason progression here, of course, one of the biggest things to pay attention to with NCAA football is the stagnation of the progression. I don't mean stagnation in players don't progress. That would almost be better sometimes. But every player progresses with pretty much the same rate. You see Christian Klump here gets a +6. Jay Ballmer got a +5. Otherwise, everybody else is somewhere in the range of +4 all the way up to +6. Every once in a while, you have one player that really has a bad offseason and only gets a +3 progression. But for the most part, every player progresses pretty much the same. And what that means is, year in and year out, you're not going to see much change in your depth chart except for players graduating. So we have continued to try and innovate in that regard for a lot of the dynasties that you'll see out here. And we are going to add in a little bit of modification randomness that allows us to spice up the progression and make things a little bit different from what you would normally expect to see. And what that's going to allow us to do is that's going to end up bringing in some randomness to the proceedings, as well as make things just a bit more interesting for you guys. But before we talk about that, we want to talk about a legend of the Panther program that we're saying goodbye to, and that, of course, is Jay Keys. All-time Pitt leader in receiving yards, all-time Pitt leader in receptions, second in touchdowns behind only the great Larry Fitzgerald. He also threw touchdowns in his career. He ran for touchdowns in his career. Look at this, 10 rushing touchdowns, 7 rushing touchdowns in the 2020 football season. I believe that season he had 16 receiving touchdowns, 7 rushing touchdowns, and he threw a touchdown as well, as we see his pass. Threw 2 touchdowns that season, 4 completions, 2 touchdowns. The guy was an absolute animal. He deserved Heisman votes that particular year. He didn't even finish in the top 5 of the Heisman. If you can't get a player into the top 5 of the Heisman with 16 touchdowns, over 100 catches receiving, over 100 yards and 7 touchdowns rushing, and 2 passing touchdowns as well, I don't know what you can do. But of course, Jay Keys will be going to the NFL draft. He did not go to the draft because his rating isn't the highest in the simulation, but we will be sending him to the NFL draft, and we'll see more news on that in the future. Also, A.C. Reese transferring to the University of Cincinnati, the same Cincinnati Bearcats that went 13-0, or 12-0, I should say, last season in the regular season, won the American Conference, controversially left out of the college football playoff, instead played in the Peach Bowl versus Alabama, where they lost by 1 possession. Very impressive for them. A.C. Reese will be gone. Tyquan Sutton as well will be leaving the program on a medical red shirt. Of course, he has been declared unfit to play. Remember, he broke vertebrae in his spine on a play in his freshman season. His first career sack, unfortunately, led to the end of his college football career. And so those are some of the key players that we know that will be leaving the program, of course. So A.C. Reese will be gone. Jay Keys will be gone. Tyquan Sutton will be gone. But we haven't heard the last of A.C. Reese. Of course, he'll be at Cincinnati. Jay Keys going to the National Football League. And Tyquan Sutton, he's going to stay on with the program potentially and become, a graduate assistant. We'll give him those opportunities. He's still a youngster that we will, unfortunately, 5-star recruit, formerly athlete, came in, all the hope in the world for him. Looked to be a really talented player, but career cut short by injury, very unfortunately. And of course, we did cut a couple of the walk-ons that the CPU had signed for us as well to get our roster down under 70 players. And there goes A.C. Reese. So very, very sad to lose some of those players, but excited for the new beginnings that they'll have available to them. And now this is the fun part of the offseason. From OperationSports.com, have to give all the credit in the world to Cockeye, who came up with this wonderful progression system. You guys remember in previous seasons, I had been doing progression on kind of a random basis. Basically, 8 players would randomly get selected with a random number generator, and then they would randomly have a 1 to 10 number generated, and they would lose potentially that many overall points. Okay, so if you generate an 8, you would lose 8 overall points, and I would dish that out as needed. I'd also give 4 players the opportunity to progress on a random selection, and then same thing 1 to 10. So you could have a big growth for a few players, and you'd have big regression for a few players, and it would just spice up the progression a little bit beyond what the default NCAA game provides. That said, Cockeye did a great job of coming up, and if you go to OperationSports.com, the EA Sports College Football Forums, you'll be able to follow his PDF in full. A wonderful system that allows you to basically use a random dice roll to have 50% chance that your players will not change, 33% chance that your players will regress some amount, and then a 1 in 6 chance that your players will progress some additional amount before what the game provides. And again, it allows guys to just have excellent off seasons or potentially slack off in the off season and allow you to see some changes in your year-to-year dynasty. And that's what we've done here. And you can see the spreadsheet, and the numbers may confuse you a little bit, but there's the roster with the player names in it and the numbers next to them. So like 46, 24, 22, etc. That is the number you would use in the spreadsheet or document provided that tells you by how much to change their attributes. And you can see we did actually get a little bit lucky on these rolls here, and that we had less than the expected amount of players regress, a little bit more than the expected amount of players progress, and then barely a little bit more than the expected amount of players not have any changes to their overall. And we're going to go through that process from the spreadsheet and now take a look and see how that affected our players in game. And so let's take a look at how the roster shakes out following this progression. You can see Malachi Bordeaux now the top overall player on the roster, Luke Davis second, Johnny Midday third, Davion Reynolds fourth. You can see we've only got 4 players at 90 or better now at this point in time. And if we go position by position, CJ Kirk still very, very good, 88 overall, and expecting big things out of the sophomore. Noah Brooks 77, senior Austin Penny freshman 75 overall, so they're very comparable at that point. Halfback Davion Reynolds 90 overall, he's a stud. We expect a lot out of him. Daenerys Carter looking very good, redshirt junior with good speed. I expect some good things out of him, finally getting a chance to play. Colin Wells there as well, DeAnthony Hamilton the true freshman, and then Xavier Godfrey, the redshirt junior halfback, has had a tough go finding playing time here. Lysander, the fullback. And then, of course, we go over to the receivers and the big storyline. Ceno Rogers. It's great speed. I think he and Onyango can do big things as far as extending the field. Onyango's more of the deep threat. Rogers is probably more of a slot type guy. And then, of course, KJ Welch, who's been so good for the last 2 seasons, still here. And then we have a number of different players who could make an impact. Shane Mitchell, Nash Jackson, Quincy Veers, all players that are going to be in the mix for playing time because we don't really have any super standouts at those positions. Tight ends, Christian Klump, the redshirt freshman, redshirted last year, former 4-star tight end prospect, looking very good. He's a receiving threat, while Jay Ballmer will be in for more of receiving type plays. And then, of course, we have Stover, who will likely redshirt this year. Wendell Matthews at left tackle. I mean, he didn't really make any progress from last season now, so tough go of it there. We got J.P. West Turner behind him and Lonnie Jackson, the junior. For the future, Joel Sykes, true sophomore, looks very, very good. And then, of course, John Browning, thankfully, adds some nice depth for us, even if he's not going to start. Luke Davis, the senior, looking very good. Trey Brown, sophomore, behind him, ready to start next year. Hopefully get some good progression moving forward. Charles Rhodes at right guard, of course, very, very talented player. J.D. Harris behind him and Ollie Patterson. Some depth cover. Daniel Jenkins, the senior, and David Horn, the freshman, behind him. Left end, Marcus Lanier now outranking Jalen Hills, our left end, tied for the team lead in sacks last season. He had a tough go of it in the second half of the year and tough go right now, so we'll see what that means moving forward. Mac McAlevey still looking very good, and Kenny O'Neill likely to see some playing time as well, so we'll see how that defensive line shakes out. And here's where, again, we saw some differences in the progression. Malachi Bordeaux still very good. Ryan Jacobs, true junior, very good. Conley Copeland, the freshman, got a nice boost. He's definitely going to be in the mix for playing time. Tristan Alvarado and Xavier Gosselin, both very similar type players. They'll both definitely see the field this year. Talik Bridges, outside linebacker, is solid. Dominic Christian behind him, just adding some depth. Dio Langston continuing to improve, looking very, very good. 80 overall now as a sophomore, the former JUCO, joining the team. Estes got a nice bounce as well, but we may redshirt him just because we have players that can fill in those positions, such as Deuce Holland, the redshirt junior. He doesn't have a starting outside position lockdown, so he may feature kind of across the board for us defensively in the linebacker role. Then at corner, Brian Youngling, 88 overall. Scott Whaley, 88 overall. Damian Vector, 88 overall. We're not going to see much change from last year. Vector and Whaley on the outside, Youngling in the slot. Jordan Murphy Jr. is going to come in and play as the dime corner, but some good progression there. And the big move, Cedric Granger over to free safety. And he went from being an 86 overall corner with not great speed to now an 88 overall free safety with, again, not spectacular speed, but he doesn't have to play against those outside receivers, those slot receivers necessarily anymore, where that's going to be as big of a hindrance. For his awareness, we kind of just took the median. He was a 99 awareness as a corner, and if you just played him at safety while leaving him at corner, he was at 50. So I basically just did a median of that and put him at 72. Keon Gibbs right behind, as well as Cameron Taylor-Smith, all guys that could feature this season at that position. If Granger struggles, who knows? He's never played safety for us, so that's a big move for him, and it helps shore up what could have been a big weakness this year. Matt Emery, nice looking player here for his senior year. Matt right behind him, as is Kenton Hill. Then at kicker, Johnny Midday, sophomore, going to be an absolute beast for us, and continue that, while Josh Feldman, the freshman punter. So there's our progression moving into next season. And now the final teaser for you guys in this episode before we head into our Season 7 preview episode, the season preview, and then the season opening game will follow that. Let's take a look at our schedule for this upcoming season. We will open with 3 straight home games. West Virginia, as we get the Backyard Brawl back underway. Remember, we played them in the college football playoff. That was just a little bit of a teaser. Now we get the season series going again. We're taking West Virginia at home. Tennessee at home. They beat us away from home last year. And then Florida State at home. We will then go away to UCLA. We beat them at home last year in a dramatic comeback, you'll remember. At Virginia and at Duke. So 3 ACC games in the first 6 weeks already. We'll then take on Virginia Tech at home, Coastal Carolina at home, Georgia Tech at home, and senior night will be North Carolina at home. And we'll finish up with 2 away games at Syracuse at the Carrier Dome. We took them on at home last season, so they'll be our second cross-divisional game beyond Florida State, and then Miami at home to finish the season. So let me know in the comments which of those games you're most excited for. I think there's a couple I can already pick out that I know people will really be looking forward to, but let me know in the comments what you're most excited to, what you thought of the progression that we've instituted now in this dynasty, and how excited you are for the start of Season 7 here on College Football Revamped. So as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Hail to Pitt. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.